continues next.
I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington.
And I'm Joey Chen at CNN Center in Atlanta. To our viewers, we want to bring you up to date on the latest developments in America's new war, the fight against terrorism. President Bush has declared the United States at war and called on the country's fighting men and women to get ready. Today, he huddled with his top security advisors at Camp David. Meeting with President Bush at this hour are the Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and other top military advisors. The focus for them is to define the enemy and to offer a response. The president warning this is a different kind of enemy, fighting on a battlefield without boundaries. In New York and in Washington today, massive rescue operations continue at the World Trade Center. 152 bodies recovered, and the list of the missing grows to more than 4,900 people. On Wall Street, officials from the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ say that all systems are go, that the U.S. markets will be able to open as planned Monday at 9:30 in the morning Eastern. These markets have been closed now for 4 days, which is the longest time since World War I. Earlier in the day, officials tested the databases and communication lines of the exchanges and concluded that the market is ready for business. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill is planning to attend Monday's opening bell.
President Bush, meanwhile, is steeling the nation for an assault on terrorism that he vows will go on, quote, as long as it takes. CNN's White House correspondent Kelly Wallace is near Camp David, joins us now with more. Kelly, tell us what's going on.
Well, Wolf, President Bush sending out a number of messages as he and his aides go over military options. He's telling a public anxious for some sort of retaliation to be patient. At the same time, he is preparing the American people for a military campaign against terrorists and those who harbor them that could last months, if not years, and could involve using ground troops.
Spending the weekend at the secluded presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains, President Bush huddles with his national security team and prepares the American people for war.
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly.
The president refuses to discuss military options, but for the first time, he specifically named suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden as a, quote, prime suspect behind Tuesday's terrorism spree. Bin Laden is believed to be hiding out in Afghanistan, with the ruling Taliban government providing him safe haven.
This act will not stand. We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes. We will get them running. And we'll bring him to justice.
When asked if those words mean President Bush is considering using ground troops to attack terrorists, aides say nothing has been ruled out. But winning this so-called war and finding the elusive bin Laden won't be easy, says a former Clinton administration official.
We're not fighting a military, we're not fighting an organized power, but we're fighting a very diffuse and shadowy organization that has links in many different parts of the world.
Knowing Americans are hungry for swift retaliation, the president uses his radio address to say a sweeping response will come in time.
You will be asked for your patience, for the conflict will not be short. You will be asked for resolve, for the conflict will not be easy. You will be asked for your strength, because the course to victory may be long.
And aides say President Bush has gained strength from his meeting Friday with more than 200 family members with loved ones still missing, believing his job is to turn their sorrow into something positive for future generations.
And while the American people overwhelmingly support some form of military retaliation, keeping that support up could become a bigger and bigger challenge for the president over time, especially if any lengthy campaign involves the loss of additional American lives. Wolf?
Kelly, tell our viewers why the White House regards Pakistan and Pakistan's cooperation as so important to this new war on terrorism.
Well, Wolf, of course, Pakistan neighbors Afghanistan and is one of only 3 countries recognizing the ruling Taliban government as the government of Afghanistan. And of course, we know the Taliban providing safe haven to Osama bin Laden. We do know, according to a Pakistani official, that President Bush called Pakistani President Musharraf this morning to thank him for his support. The White House had no comment on the call, but Secretary of State Colin Powell confirming today what CNN had been reporting since yesterday, that the Pakistanis have agreed to fully cooperate with the U.S. in the fight against terrorism. Secretary Powell saying that the Pakistanis have agreed to all of the requests made by the United States, and sources saying one of those requests include allowing U.S. warplanes access to Pakistani airspace if the U.S. decides to attack, and obviously very crucial for U.S. warplanes to fly into that airspace if there is any attack on Afghanistan. Wolf, back to you.
And Kelly, while I have you, we saw Vice President Dick Cheney sitting alongside the president at that meeting at Camp David. Earlier in the week, they had separated supposedly out of security concerns. They didn't want the president and the vice president at the same location. Are those security concerns gone now, or is Camp David unique?
Well, security concerns are still there, Wolf. You know, the U.S. still operating on a high state of alert. As you noted, Vice President Cheney spending a few days at Camp David because the U.S. Secret Service deciding, based on ongoing security concerns, that it would be best not to have the president and the vice president in the same location. But they both are at Camp David. It is obviously a very secure location, but I do believe that the U.S. still very concerned about the security threat out there and still operating on a high state of alert. Wolf.
Kelly Wallace near Camp David up in Thurmont, Maryland. Thank you very much. And we do have some news that our Justice Department producer Terry Friedman is informing us about. I want to be very precise. The Justice Department has just issued a second warrant, a second arrest warrant in connection with what is described as another material witness in this continuing investigation. We do not yet know the names or other details. Of course, we'll be providing those details to you as they become available. Once again, a second arrest warrant for a material witness just issued by the Justice Department. Meanwhile, even as the nation's military prepares for the next stage, rescue workers continue the grim task of recovering the bodies of the 189 victims of the Pentagon attack. CNN's military affairs correspondent Jamie McIntyre once again joins us now live. Jamie, give us the headlines.
Well, Wolf, the recovery effort here continues, and then the move will begin to shore up the building and strip away so it can be rebuilt. Just a short time ago, though, the Pentagon released some of its video that was shot by an Air Force cameraman of the initial aftermath of the plane hitting the side of the building. This video shot by Tech Sergeant Robert Stenberg, who grabbed his camera and got out in time to capture the side of the Pentagon actually collapsing. This happened about 45 minutes or so after the plane hit the building. Today, Pentagon, the project director for renovation, said that because of the reinforcement that had been put into this recently renovated part of the Pentagon, it held long enough for people to get out of that section of the building who weren't actually killed by the impact. It didn't collapse right away. It held long enough for people to get out, so they say that that was one of the improvements that had been put into the Pentagon as part of the renovation that paid off. Other improvements included special blast-proof glass that did not shatter, even the windows right near the impact area, sprinklers that kept the fire from spreading in one direction, and also special fire retardant walls as well. Wolf?
I don't know if you can answer this question, Jamie, but I'll ask you anyhow. How do officials in the building that you cover, the Pentagon, feel about eventually reopening Reagan National Airport, which of course is so close to the Pentagon?
Well, you know, I've only talked informally to people about this. I think the general feeling is that if the airport were to remain closed forever, that it would be handing the terrorists a victory, that it's important for the United States to go back to operate more normally, just as it's important to rebuild the Pentagon. Of course, the Pentagon is on a flight path right over National Airport, Reagan National Airport. The Secretary of Defense says he has got planes going over his office every 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the landing pattern. So it's very difficult to protect this building against a plane impact. But remember, the plane that crashed into this building did not take off from Reagan National Airport. It took off from Dulles, about 20 miles from here.
Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon, once again, thank you very much. Back to you, Joey.
Wolf, the view now from a place so many of us know so very little about, but in Afghanistan right now, there's a clear sense of fear. The possibility of a U.S. attack because Afghanistan plays host to prime suspect Osama bin Laden. CNN's Nick Robertson reports now via videophone from Kabul.
Well, the latest information we have is that the Iranian government has ordered its border with Afghanistan sealed in the case of the aftermath of an American attack on Afghanistan, that refugees try and flood across the border. Iran says it has 2 million Afghan refugees already and can't take any more. Now, this comes hard on the heels of the Pakistani government giving the go-ahead to United States support. That has implications in Afghanistan as well, because it could mean the border with Pakistan and Afghanistan is sealed. That would mean in the capital here, Kabul, and other cities around the country, shortages of food. Most food coming to Afghanistan comes from Pakistan and Iran. So the outlook for the people here in Kabul and the other cities, fairly bleak. Already we know that there's been a little panic buying, people trying to buy up supplies in case of attack. Food prices have gone up 10 to 15%, and those with a little bit more money have been trying to get out of the city to see relatives in the country, or if they can, flee across those borders, particularly to Pakistan, before the borders close. The Taliban today did try to put pressure on Pakistan not to sign up to help America. They threatened that if any neighbor, particularly an Islamic one, was to help America by giving it soil or airspace to America, then they would consider them an enemy as well in case of attack, and then they might invade that country as well. So that a clear statement, a clear threat towards Pakistan. A Council of Elders today also told the Taliban here in Afghanistan that they shouldn't close the door to diplomacy, but they did say, and they made it very clear, that if Afghanistan was attacked, then the Council of Elders, which represents many of the tribes here in Afghanistan, would throw their complete support behind the Taliban. Nick Robertson, CNN, Kabul, Afghanistan.
So if the president does order an attack, the question here, how does the United States build and keep the support of key players, and what role would other nations play? CNN military affairs consultant General Wesley Clark is joining us here in the studio. General, if you could explain to us, a lot of us think of you military men as making simply military decisions and not being too concerned about the diplomatic side, but really it must be hand in hand.
Well, in any military operation, the diplomacy actually has to go first, because you have to gain access for the military forces. But in this case, it's even more intricate, because the primary weapon will be information and police actions, and the military will only come later, or if there's a particular requirement for the military. So the lead has to be held by the diplomats in this.
Talk to us about the
look at it on the
locations
map.
of things. Right, General.
So, this is the area that everyone's concerned about, the country of Afghanistan. Surrounded by Pakistan on the south and east, Iran on the west, former states of the Soviet Union on the north, and somewhere in here, we believe, is Osama bin Laden. The Taliban movement has said that it will basically support him. It will not cooperate with the United States in turning him in. But the Taliban movement has been supported by and has relations with the government of Pakistan. The government of Pakistan has, and its president, have pledged full support and cooperation to the United States. Presumably, this government will help cut off support to the Taliban and Osama bin Laden.
So when we say the United States would like full support from Pakistan, what is it that the United States would need from Pakistan?
Well, let's speak hypothetically, because Secretary Powell has said he's going to keep that private, exactly what's been asked. But, for example, the things that you might ask are, first, cut off all supplies to the terrorists. Isolate and contain...
Because Afghanistan needs both food and fuel through Pakistan.
That's exactly right. And communications, and money, and weapons, and explosives, and many other things. So we want to cut this supply line. Then if there are terrorist groups inside Pakistan, they need to be detained. And then if we have information about the locations of the terrorist groups inside Afghanistan, Pakistan needs to provide that information to the United States. And the list goes on and on and on about what specific information could be provided, what specific assistance could be given. And those will be matters of the closest, most detailed consultation between the United States and Pakistan. But the ideal solution to this crisis is and remains that the Taliban itself has a change of heart. and recognizes that what Osama bin Laden has done is not representative of Islam at all, but the opposite, and turns him over to justice.
So if Islamic leaders then would join, not only in Afghanistan but throughout the region, if Islamic leaders would join in putting the pressure on to say, look, it is time to turn him over,
that's exactly right.
That would
That's
be
exactly
the better
right.
resolution
That's
from your point of view.
That is the correct resolution. This is a problem for the world community. It's just that it happened on U.S. soil, but these people represent a threat to the entire world.
You talk about the involvement of the world community. Of course, there has been support, certainly from our allies in Europe, throughout the world. Even President Putin has spoken very positively of the need for support. But these nations, in order to offer support, I mean, first of all, what kind of support would they be able to give? And in return, wouldn't they be anticipating some quid pro quo?
Well, there's no question that in most of the Arab nations, the moderate Arab nations in the Middle East and North Africa, there are cells that are associated with the terrorists that have been trained by Osama bin Laden or in some way connected. And many of these governments are also under some degree of threat from these Islamic extremists. And so when they take actions to support us, they do put themselves in some degree of jeopardy. So we know we're asking a lot, but on the other hand, they're the ones who can best take this action. And that's why it is absolutely a coalition, an allied operation. It's an allied diplomatic, political operation, police operation, intelligence operation, before it ever becomes a military operation.
And then in the nature, we were speaking a moment ago about President Putin and European leaders, for example, who might in some way be able to assist the United States in whatever operation it chooses. In return, what might President Putin, other leaders, European leaders, want from the United States?
Well, I think that as we've started this operation, it's directed very narrowly at the people who did this terrible set of deeds on the 11th of September. But as we begin to unravel the network, we'll find it's connected to many of the other terrorist networks in the world. And so I think it's inevitable there'll be some degree of pressure to enlarge the scope of the operation. If they're cooperating with us to go after terrorists that did this to the United States, what about the terrorists who have been active or believed to be active against their own countries? And that's taking place in many countries around the world. So nations are not only acting out of concern for us, but they're also joining with us in their own self-interest.
In terms of the hardware considerations on the military front, can you talk to us about what the expectations would be and the timeline for any movements if a decision were to be made?
Well, I think there's a broad range of options, and I think they're self-evident almost. You've got cruise missiles, which we've used before against the terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. We can use a variety of...
Not particularly too effective.
Not too effective. Well, they struck the target, but as in any case, when you're trying to hit a specific group of people, you have no assurance that they'll be there when the missiles arrive on target. We saw the very effective use of long-range bombers with precision-guided weapons in the Kosovo Air Campaign Operation Allied Force a couple of years ago. So we have that option. We have aviation that can be positioned in the region, either in bases and refueled en route, or maybe naval aviation. We could get land forces in there, although land forces take time. The larger the force, the longer it takes to get there, and the more complicated the logistics build up. A decade ago, we did Operation in the Persian Gulf, Operation Desert Storm, and it took 5-6 months to build up that ground force, get it ready, staged on the ground, and moved. Since then, we've improved our response time in the Persian Gulf, but this is a new theater of concern, and we'd have to look at this very carefully, so we might be weeks, months away from taking action. As the President said, it's going to require sustained dedication, resolve on the part of the American people and the world community to go after this threat.
Former Supreme Allied Commander for NATO, General Wesley Clark, now military consultant to CNN. We appreciate your insight. Wolf?
Thank you, Joey. And powerful words are being used today. Talk of war, international cooperation, calling up the military reserves. Someone who knows about using those words is the former Secretary of State, Lawrence Eagleburger, and he joins us now. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. You were a key State Department official during the Gulf War some 10 years ago. Tell our viewers what is going to be the major difference between this anticipated upcoming war and the war that all of us remember, the Gulf War.
The differences are significant, Wolf, the first of which is we clearly knew who our enemy was in the Iraq situation. What I think everyone needs to understand, and General Clark certainly talked about this, is that this time around we have a lot of enemies. We know some of them. We will find out more of them. They have an interlocking network. There's no question about that. And it's going to be much tougher to get at them. And it's going to be therefore a much more complicated and long-term effort. The Iraq war was over in 6 weeks, whatever it was. That will not be the case this time. This is going to take some years to accomplish, and you have to hope and pray that the President can lead us all for that period of time and keep the support up.
If the President concludes that Osama bin Laden was in fact responsible and he continues to receive protection from the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, does that necessarily mean the U.S. should engage in a land invasion of Afghanistan?
I think that would be, under most circumstances, the last thing we would want to do. Putting land forces into some place like Afghanistan, in the first place, we saw how successful the Soviet Union was. If you get all of the Afghanis opposed to you, it can be a very unpleasant circumstance. I would think that with our technology, if we know where he is, and that's the first question, I should think we could get at him and at the Taliban without having to put troops on the ground.
But you well know there are so many places to hide in Afghanistan, caves, all sorts of locations within the mountainous terrain there. It would be almost impossible without putting people on the ground to find him. A lot of experts say that.
Well, they can say that if they want, and I don't claim to be an expert. On the other hand, well, how many people are you going to put on the ground in Afghanistan to try to find him? It would seem to me thousands, and you'd be running around in an area we know very little about. I'm not saying that in the end we might not have to do something like that, but I think there are all sorts of alternatives that have to be examined first. And by the way, let's make it very clear that while Osama bin Laden is the immediate source of our agony, he is by no means the only problem we face, and if we got him tomorrow morning, he has a whole host of lieutenants and an organization that would carry on. So let's not get mesmerized by Osama bin Laden, despite the fact we have to get him at some point. That doesn't mean we necessarily have to start there. It does mean we have to recognize we have a web of terrorist organizations, all of whom mean us evil, and we're going to have to deal with all of that. It may take some time to organize our intelligence enough to know exactly what we're dealing with here, but if we think that this has to begin with an attack on Osama bin Laden, I think we are making a mistake. That isn't to say he shouldn't be public enemy number one, at least for the moment. But it is to say that this is a much more complicated effort than simply getting him. And to put troops into Afghanistan to accomplish this effort of getting bin Laden may be a real mistake.
What else can the United States do with its allies against other states that may be cooperating with terrorists, may be providing support, financial support, or providing them what is called harbor? What else can the United States do against these states that the U.S. is already not doing?
Well, I think there's a lot there. Again, Wolf, it depends on the particular country. First of all,
let me give you one example. Yeah. For example, Iraq. What else could the U.S. be doing as far as Iraq is concerned?
Oh, I think that's the easiest one for me, because in that case, we could certainly escalate. We'd have to get the troops into the area and so forth, but we could certainly escalate what we have been doing to them when they misbehave as it is. And in fact, I think we've gone far too long without, in fact, cracking him across the jowls because of things he has done. Iraq is almost the easiest one, for me at least, to contemplate, because there you almost immediately go into the use of military force. The rest of the countries involved are much more complicated, if you will. First of all, the question has to be which country, how vulnerable is it to attack, but more importantly than that, what are the other sources of pressure that we may have available to us? And one of the things with regard to all of these terrorist organizations and the countries involved is we have to start by following the money. Where is the money coming from? Where is it going? Where is it hidden? Is it in Swiss banks and so forth? The other thing I would say to you, and a lot of people are going to object to this, but I think we need to get into intimate discussions with the Israelis on a whole host of these questions. We talk with them a lot now, but I really think they can offer us some real advice on intelligence matters that would be where we would be more intimately involved. They have a lot of experience in this whole area. I know there has been a reaction on the part of some Americans who say, well, we've been too close to the Israelis and that's what's caused all of this. I think that's nonsense. But I do think the Israelis, in getting together with us and talking about this experience and how to deal with it, we might learn some very valuable things from them.
Well, since you raised the issue of the Israelis, during the Gulf War, correct me if I'm wrong, you and Paul Wolfowitz, who's now the Deputy Defense Secretary, went to Israel to restrain the Israelis to prevent them from responding militarily to those Scud missiles being launched by the Iraqis. Looking back on that, was that a mistake?
No. In the first place, Wolf, it's one of the areas where, one of the few areas where I can claim some diplomatic success in my lifetime. Now, don't knock it. But the basic point here is that the effort in the Iraq case was to form a coalition of governments, particularly including a number of governments in the area, Middle Eastern governments, to deal with Iraq. And we did that. And if the Israelis had become a direct part of this, it would have made it much more difficult to build that coalition. Secondly, and I think equally important, and now I think Israelis would accept the fact, many would at least, by asking them to stay on the sidelines, we did a job for them that cost them nothing in the way of the lives of the Israeli military. So no, I don't think it was a mistake then at all. I do think this is a different situation.
Mr. Secretary, what about the existing U.S. policy barring assassinations? Is it time to rethink that policy?
I have argued for some years, to show you how awfully bloodthirsty I am, I have argued for some years that that executive order issued during President Ford's term should have been terminated long before this and certainly should be now.
Lawrence Eagleburger speaking bluntly as he always does. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Joey?
Wolf, we want to give our viewers now the latest on the investigation into the attacks. There has been a second arrest warrant issued, and CNN has learned that U.S. intelligence already apparently had an eye on at least two of the suspected hijackers even before Tuesday's assault. CNN national correspondent Mike Betcher has been following up all elements of the investigation. Mike, what can you tell us?
Well, the second warrant, Joey, was issued in New York. It was issued for material witness, but that person is not yet in custody. There is only one other material witness so far in this case, and this was a man pulled off of a jet Thursday at Kennedy Airport. He was found to have fake pilot's ID. Now, Justice Department spokesman Mindy Tucker is saying we're at a point now where there will be more frequent and additional warrants. Now, as well, the Immigration and Naturalization Service is holding 25 people, and the Justice Department, the FBI, has been speaking to them as well. Especially two men they're very interested in, Ayub Al-Khan and Mohammed Jawed Azmath. Now, these two men were on a flight Tuesday from Newark to San Antonio when it was diverted to St. Louis. That was the morning of the hijacking. They were picked up in Fort Worth, Texas on Wednesday on a train. They were found to have box cutters. Those are the similar type items that investigators believe the hijackers used in some instances to get control of these airplanes. And we have one other late-breaking item, and it was reported by CNN correspondent Eileen O'Connor. Two of the hijackers on the American Airlines flight that slammed into the Pentagon had been under surveillance by U.S. intelligence for a few weeks before the terrorist attacks in the United States. Khalid Al-Midar was caught on surveillance. He's one of these men. He was caught on surveillance tape in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, meeting with a suspect in the bombing of the USS Cole. So this provides a link between the Cole bombing and as well the bombings terrorist attacks here in the United States. And the FBI is also looking for the FBI was looking for Al-Midar and Salem Al-Amzi prior to Tuesday's attacks. Salem Al-Amzi was an associate of Midar. So these two people, Joey, were being sought, and they didn't get to them in time.
Right, so this apparently draws a link between Tuesday's attacks and the Cole.